Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, beloveds. Welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, podcast number 7. I'm Rachel Leroy, and this time I wanted to speak about narcissism and narcissistic abuse because I think it's important to educate people about what it is, who it impacts, and what the impacts on individuals in a larger culture are. And I wanted to talk about this because based on the groups I've been in, based on the people around me, based on my personal experience, and based on my observations in culture, it's like a light went on when I learned about narcissistic abuse. And I'm aware that this does not apply to all of my listeners, but it may still be helpful to you because you may have other friends who suffer from the impacts of this. I believe a large portion of people with mental health issues either might be narcissists themselves, they might be on the narcissistic spectrum. In psychology, there's something called the narcissistic spectrum, and you can have different diagnosed disorders that are in that narcissistic spectrum. For example, borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, BPD and NPD. And I wanted to talk about this because I think especially in the Christian community, it's not something that's being talked about enough. People are just now starting to talk about it. And sometime in the near future, I want to talk about abuse within religious communities, whether they're churches or they're online or they're in families or there are other groups of people where narcissistic abuse can actually go on within religious communities. And today, though, I wanted to talk more about narcissistic abuse in terms of relationships and in the family with childhood and in terms of society. Because what I'm seeing from my experience and in groups I'm in is that this is an epidemic. It's everywhere. And most people don't even know it exists. And when I first discovered what narcissistic abuse was, and when I started connecting the dots of things that I had tried to figure out what was wrong with me, why did I suffer from anxiety, why did I suffer from depression, why was I always in fight or flight mode, why did I feel so bad about myself, why was I always afraid, what was wrong with me, why couldn't I release the emotional issues that I had no matter what I tried. I had done everything you can imagine, and nothing worked. Once I understood this experience, like I said, this is not the root of everybody's trauma, and it's not the root of everybody's emotional issues that they need to heal. Okay, so that's not what I'm saying. But a large portion of people that suffer from some kind of adverse childhood experiences and that suffer from some kind of emotional conditions, mental health issues, beyond just day-to-day stress that everybody experiences, a large portion of those people, I believe, are the survivors of narcissistic abuse. So I want to talk a little bit about what narcissistic abuse is, what is a narcissist, how do you spot one, what are some of the specific ways that they act towards the people that they mistreat, and what should you do about it? What are some of the solutions that you can take in order to heal yourself, in order to protect yourself, and in order to deal with the narcissist. So like I said, I don't want this to be the only focus of this podcast. It's a broader podcast that involves people that are on the emotional recovery journey from different experiences, but this is a large portion of what this podcast is about. So I wanted to talk first about what a narcissist is and how to spot a narcissist. So I went straight to Wikipedia, where it has narcissistic abuse. And it says that narcissistic abuse refers to any abuse by a narcissist, particularly emotional abuse in parent-child and adult-to-adult relationships. The term was coined by Sam Vaknin in 1999. Yes, he had a support group for victims of narcissists. So it's basically just in the last decade or two that experts have begun to understand what narcissism is in terms of how it impacts relationships and how it impacts the survivors or the victims of narcissistic abuse. And people that have been victims or survivors of narcissistic parents or siblings or other family members or in a relationship or a marriage, they are more likely to struggle with what is called codependency. And an adult who is in a relationship with a narcissist also likely struggles with having a normal relationship. So basically, a common trend that happens is somebody is raised in any different possible combinations of family dynamic, but there's dysfunction there. And chances are somewhere in the parenting dynamic, there's a narcissist. And a narcissist is, according to Wikipedia, it's the pursuit of gratification from vanity and egotistical admiration of one's idealized self, image, and attributes. So, that's the one that you think of in Greek mythology where the guy's looking at himself, he falls in love with his own reflection, and he's just self-absorbed. If that was the extent of it, it would not be such a big deal, except that obviously vanity is a sin, but it wouldn't impact other people as much. What makes narcissism so problematic is that it's a social and a cultural problem. It's hidden. It's epidemic. And most people don't even see it as abuse, but it is abuse. And narcissism is basically a trait where the person is not capable of empathy. The person will do anything that it takes to get their needs met, even if it's at the expense of the other person, even if they have to control that person or manipulate that person. And there are different types of narcissism, and there are different types of narcissists. So some of the traits and signs of narcissism: they're self-absorbed, they are arrogant, and they often think they're better than other people, or their needs are more important, or their points of view are more valid. They tend to put themselves in a leadership role of authority over other people, and they believe they're entitled to that. Just because somebody's in a leadership role or they're confident doesn't make them a narcissist. And it's also important to note that there are different levels of narcissists on the spectrum. There are a lot of people that are narcissists, but they're high-functioning narcissists. They're capable of some empathy. They have some give where they're able to negotiate in relationships, but they're highly confident and they're natural-born leaders. And that actually serves a purpose in society. However, when it gets into the point where somebody's insecure, abusive, they're a megalomaniac, they can't think about anything but themselves, and they're completely selfish all the time, that's when it becomes abuse and it becomes a problem. And the kind that's harmful is when somebody has an exploitative personality and they have an entitlement issue. And I don't mean just, I want those shoes, I've got to get those shoes. I mean like how they treat other people. They will do anything that it takes to get what they want, even if they have to manipulate, even if they have to brainwash, even if they have to control and abuse. So some of the other qualities of a narcissist: shamelessness. Narcissists are not capable of shame in the sense that they don't feel guilt when they do something wrong. They're likely to try to justify their actions because somehow they're the exception to the rule. They also have something called magical thinking. They see themselves as perfect using distortion and illusion, known as magical thinking. And sometimes they'll project their own problems onto other people, especially the victim, the survivor, and the codependent. For example, if you have two people in a marriage and one person is a narcissist and the other is a codependent, the codependent may be very fawning and very giving and very nurturing and try to fulfill the needs of the narcissist, and the narcissist takes advantage of that, and they may take their issues and dump them onto the codependent and say, well, you're self-absorbed. Well, what you're doing is selfish. If the codependent tells their spouse, I would like to take an afternoon to myself and take a nap and go for a walk and go hang out with my friends. And, that's a reasonable thing. Anybody should be able to ask, especially if they have a family and they work, and their spouse, should be able to give them that time. But a narcissist might say something like, and this might be something that they hardly ever do, and that they're always the one giving. The narcissist might say something like, you're selfish. All you think about is yourself. You want to leave me here with the kids, and you're not thinking about how that impacts other people. And it might be that the narcissist is the one that's always at work, that the other person is the one that's always home, but they take their issue that they're having and they project it onto that person when actually that's their guilt that they can't handle, and they project it onto somebody else. Another quality is arrogance. A narcissist, when they feel deflated, in order to build themselves back up, they have this deep sense of core insecurity at the root of their persona or their identity. And so their sense of self-importance, they'll do anything that they can to feel better. And one way they get temporary relief is by diminishing, debasing, and degrading somebody else. And just because somebody does some of these things doesn't make them a narcissist. But if they have tons of these qualities and there's a chronic pattern, there's a good chance they're a narcissist. And arrogance is another one. That's the one I just went through. Envy. A narcissist may have a sense of superiority over other people. And if somebody in any way they feel threatened by them, they may try to minimize the other person or their achievements. Entitlement. A narcissist will hold an unreasonable set of expectations, particularly favorable treatment and automatic compliance because they consider themselves special. Like I said, the rules don't apply to them. They're somehow the exception to the rule. Very ungodly attitude, not manifesting any of the fruits of the Spirit. Exploitation. They can take many forms, but it could be basically without regard to the feelings and interests of others. And if they do act that way, a lot of times they're doing it because they want something. So knowing their true motives can be difficult. Often the other person is in a subservient position where resistance would be difficult or even impossible. It's a very degrading position for the person that may have to deal with the narcissist. Exploitation, though, like I said, it can take many forms. Bad boundaries. Narcissists do not recognize and respect the boundaries of others. And that can be with somebody's time. That can be with what someone finds acceptable behavior. That can be with how someone else's persona is acknowledged. For example, others exist to meet their needs, and their needs, the other person's needs, don't really matter. So, for example, let's say that somebody throws a birthday party for a mutual friend, and the narcissist and another friend are throwing the party. Well, they might throw all of the work onto the other friend, and then when the party happens, they might take credit for all of the work and bask in that glory. And on top of that, the friend may say, well, I need you to show up at 5 o'clock so we can set up for the party. And then the narcissist might show up 20 minutes before the party and not even tell the other person, and feel like when the other person is annoyed or frustrated, as they have every right to be, because there was no communication, the other person will say, oh, chill out, you're the one that's overreacting. And so just disrespecting somebody's individuality, their autonomy as a human being. And so that goes into narcissistic personality disorder when it gets on the really high end of the spectrum. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what some of the traits of a narcissist are, some that you would want to look out for. And narcissistic abuse occurs in both adult to adult relationships, according to Wikipedia, and also in adult to child relationships. So basically, a narcissist needs to gain admiration of their own attributes and feelings of power and control, and this is called narcissistic supply. And what usually happens is that the narcissist, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, a spouse, a sibling, a good friend, a cousin, whoever, a teacher, a coach, a preacher, it can be anybody. Somebody that's in a position of power or that puts themselves in a position of power will pick a person or a group of people, usually someone who has traits that they feel threatened by, or someone who's vulnerable and helpless, such as a child, and they will use that person as their narcissistic supply. And they create a dynamic as an abuser with their victim in a relationship through a cycle of abuse, resulting in what's called traumatic bonding or trauma bonding. And that makes it hard for the other person to leave that increasingly abusive relationship. Trauma bonding is like, for example, let's say a boy is raised by a narcissistic father, and he can never do anything right. Everything that he does, the father takes credit for if he accomplishes anything. He never gives him recognition, and he never praises him for anything. He never says he loves them, the boy, let's say. In a case like that, the narcissist is the father, and in many cases, either the boy grows up to become a codependent, where he is always trying to earn, on a neurotic level. We all want approval, but he does it on a neurotic level. He never feels enough. He never feels good enough. And there's a good chance he may not fully understand why. It's right in front of him. But this stuff, his father will like, maybe he goes to all his ball games and he takes him to Disney World. And he says, I love you. But he does all this other stuff too behind closed doors. And then the boy's confused when he grows up because he can't figure out why he suffers from depression and why he's codependent. And his father says, oh, you were never abused. Maybe his dad never hit him. His dad never sexually molested him, but he is messed up. And it's hard to make that connection because you're told your whole life you weren't abused, you had a good childhood, you had a good childhood. And you can be told that so many times. That's not to say that the narcissistic father wasn't there for his son, that he didn't love him, that he didn't do some good things for him, but there was a lot there that was dysfunctional and messed up, and that child did not get seen. He did not get his needs met. Everything was about the father. And so the child grows up feeling like he's nothing. And when he makes that connection, and on a visceral level, that's when he's able to start making some healing changes in his life. So that's just an example of a codependent narcissistic relationship and a parent-child relationship, or it could be any two family members where one is older or has more power. It happens in marriages, it happens in romantic relationships, and some people think that the narcissist is always the male and that the codependent is always the female. And while that is a more common dynamic, it's also becoming more increasingly common to see the woman be the narcissist and the male be the codependent. And I totally believe that women can abuse men physically, mentally, sexually, and emotionally, and just as much as men can abuse women. Both men and women can be victims of narcissistic abuse. And on the narcissistic spectrum, there are narcissists, which are more in the range of people that are functioning in society. They may do a lot of this stuff in secret. They may do a lot of it out in the open. It just depends. One that does it in secret is called a covert narcissist. They're especially manipulative, and that's when a lot of times the victim, if they try to say something to other people won't believe them. They'll believe the narcissist. And it's hard to believe that some people are this kind of cruel person in private, but I've seen it so many times where people look up to somebody who they're out in the community, they're helping people, they're doing all this good work, and maybe they're doing it from a genuine place, but then they go home and they talk down to their kids and they mistreat them and they ignore them and they talk bad about them and they talk about how worthless they are and tear them down. Or if somebody's abusing them, they don't do anything to stop it, and then like everything that they say and think is invalid. So it happens. Covert narcissism is especially tricky. And if it's covert, it's also, I think, in my opinion, less likely that somebody who has experienced covert narcissistic abuse, they're less likely to even know that that's what they experienced. They may think, oh, I had some, kind of a wonky childhood. It was a little dysfunctional, But when they start digging into it and they start studying this stuff and they start looking at the definition of abuse, their definition suddenly moves further back. Whereas you can't abuse somebody unless you tell them, I wish you were dead. You're stupid. And you do that daily, and you hit them in the face, and you throw plates at them, and horrible things, You chain them to a basement and starve them to death. Things like that happen, but you don't have to experience any of those things to be abused. And when people start looking at narcissism, narcissists, the spectrum, the relationship, trauma bonding, and all of that, they start to wake up if they've experienced that and see, oh my gosh, that's me. That's what's wrong with me. That's what happened to me. And that's what I've seen happen again and again and again and again. And the groups have been in dozens, hundreds, thousands of people. Like I said, not everybody is a victim of narcissistic abuse that has emotional issues, but I think it's a large portion of people. And so narcissists with their partners, with their spouses, there's usually a cycle where they do something called love bomb. And love bombing is where, you see these guys that, I'll use a guy for an example this time. These guys that, because it happens more with guys, the love bombing, where they'll basically, they meet, and 2 weeks later, he's proposing to her with a helicopter and a puppy. That was an example that R. Kelly used. Classic psychopathic narcissist. And he did that with his wife. And then she claimed that he hogtied her, chained her to a bed, and did things to her I'm not even going to mention on this podcast later on. So there's usually a fast-moving relationship. There's a lot of charisma. That's not to say all charismatic people are narcissists. They're not. The relationship moves really fast. It doesn't move slow where you really get to know somebody, including their strengths, their weaknesses, and their quirks, which is what a good relationship 90% of the time is built on. And they're trying to lure you in very quickly. They're trying to get power over you, and then they bait and switch you. And then once you marry them, suddenly those claws come out. Maybe there's some red flags beforehand where they start raising their voice at you for nothing. Smallest little things. Or you start getting confused when you're in a conversation where you bring up something you're concerned about, and somehow by the end of the conversation, somehow it's about everything you're doing wrong, and you don't even remember what the conversation was about when you started. Manipulation like that. And sabotage, and sometimes they'll get to a point where they get tired of you and they discard you. That doesn't always happen, but they turn on the charm, they suck you in. That's called hoovering and love bombing. And then when they get you, they go through this cycle of just keeping you long enough. They'll do something nice for you, and they'll be good and act kind of normal, and you'll be kind of hopeful. You're like, oh, okay, maybe this marriage can work, or maybe this relationship can work. And then the next thing you know, they do something else, and you go through the cycle where you're confused, and the person is always, it cycles in and out. And then sometimes they get to a point where they do discard. That's another common trait that a narcissist has. Once they've gotten the supply they can get from you, they will dump you and move on to somebody else. That's common. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but it's very common. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what narcissistic abuse is, what the spectrum is, how it impacts the victim or the survivor. I prefer the word survivor because it doesn't show one as being helpless, because I believe people who have experienced this can heal, and I believe that it is a choice. If somebody is in this situation where they're an adult and they look back and they realize that they've been under the control of a narcissist, it's not fair. It sucks. And what is the common advice in terms of dealing with a narcissist? It depends on the narcissist. In some cases, you can negotiate and you can find some kind of equilibrium in the relationship if they're not a severe narcissist. In those cases, you have to learn to set boundaries with the narcissist. And you can betcha, you are going to have somebody pitching a fit like a 2-year-old, and you just have to calmly keep your boundary where you need to set up some rules for this person that if you're going to be in a relationship, they are going to respect your boundaries. That is a godly concept. Even Jesus went away to different places to rest. People chased him, he got away from them. I'm not saying they're narcissists, but if you look at the Bible, it is biblical to set boundaries with people. And if you just are a doormat and let people run all over you and abuse you, then you can't be in a place to love other people. Because if you're completely drained because you're doing everything that somebody wants you to do, one, that person becomes your God, and that's idolatry. And two, you're so drained and so demeaned and so depressed that you can't function. And nobody should be treated that way over a long-term period of time. And I know that some teachers, some Christian teachers and preachers will tell you that if you are in a narcissistic marriage, that you should bear it up, that it's the lot that God gave you in life. You made a commitment in that marriage and you need to stick it through, even if they're abusive, even if you're depressed, even if they won't respect your boundaries when you set some boundaries. And I respectfully disagree with that. I do not believe that person is being faithful in the marriage if there is a chronic pattern of abuse. And no, they don't have to be hitting you and throwing things at you to be very abusive. A person can be heinously abusive and never lay a finger on somebody. They could be cheating and spending your money and lying to you behind your back, manipulating you and gaslighting you. Gaslighting is another one that I wanted to mention. And it's kind of like what I talked about earlier. Usually gaslighting involves the covert narcissist who does everything in secret, treats you great out in the open and in public. And then, when you get in behind closed doors, they're a totally different person. And so nobody believes you when you say it, usually because they're very dynamic and charismatic, and they know how to put on the charm for everybody. So it makes your point of view when you try to speak out about it not credible, even though you're the one that's telling the truth. It's insanity, it makes you crazy. And it's not fair, but that is the way that covert narcissists will work. But some of them will gaslight you. And gaslight comes from a movie that was, it was the 1930s, and it was about this man who had a woman in his relationship. I don't remember if they were just dating or if they were married, but basically, he groomed her, where he brainwashed her into thinking that she was mentally ill, she was crazy, because first he would do all these terrible things to her that would make anybody mad, like it would just be maddening. He manipulated her and talked down to her and told her all these terrible things. And then when she would say something or react, or he would put her in a position where she would react and she would take the bait because it was absolutely insanity, something he would say, then he would turn around and put it back on her and say, well, see, you're exactly the way I said you were. See, you're the one causing all the problems in the relationship. And the person spends so much time in that mindset that they literally start believing all those things about themselves. And that's how children start believing they're worthless and don't understand that they've been abused, because their minds have been told that they're not abused either implicitly or explicitly so much, they start to believe it. And in a romantic relationship, just like that movie, and a woman can do this to a man too, and it can happen in other romantic relationships as well. You don't know what's happened to you. You're so turned around and so confused that it can take months once you get out of that relationship and away from that person to get clarity on what actually happened. And your flesh will actually say, no, this is wrong. I was wrong in this. And when you start, this is why you have to deconstruct what happened, so you understand that in those kinds of cases specifically, that it wasn't your fault and the person was manipulating you. Like I said, I know that there are cases where people will play the victim and they're actually the perpetrator, and that's something that gaslighters do. And in order to know the difference between a narcissist and a codependent, if you look at the traits of one and look at the long-term patterned behaviors of a person, not what they say, what they do. Nobody's perfect. Everybody has a few narcissistic traits, and I believe narcs can also have codependent traits. But overall, you'll see a sustained pattern of the traits of narcissism in a narcissist if you know that person well. And And sometimes if you look at somebody long enough, they'll start to show their true quality. For example, R. Kelly. There are a lot of people that did not believe that he was an abuser. And now there's almost nobody that believes that. That if you go to YouTube, you can look at body language experts with his interview that he did with Gayle King. And there are smoking guns left and right that show that he's lying. He's turning on tears to try to get sympathy. He reacts very violently, which implies that in closed doors he's probably physically abusive, as many of the women claim he has been. There's just too many accusations. Once you start getting so many accusations against somebody, the truth starts coming out, and we're seeing that, with a lot of these cases that we've seen lately. But back to narcissistic abuse. How do you spot it? You need to be able to, first, this is from Psychology Today. Psychology Today, there's an article called How to Spot Narcissistic Abuse. Some of the things that they may say to you: you're stupid and worthless. Who do you think you are? You're nothing to me and nothing without me. Don't tell me what to do. I'll tell you, blah, 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 whatever. No one likes you. You don't deserve me. Don't dare think of leaving. You're the one who caused this. Now, people can say those things and not be narcissist. We've all said something like that to somebody and probably gone and apologized later, which we should. Somebody who's not a narcissist, we say things we're not proud of in the heat of a moment, when we're upset, when we're ticked off. And then when we stop and we cool down, we look back and we're like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have said that. That was hurtful to that person. And we go back and we swallow our pride and we apologize. It ain't fun, but that's what somebody who is trying to follow Christ, and that's what somebody who's trying to be a good person does. It's just, duh. Most people know that, right? A narcissist will try to cover up or justify their behavior, and if they apologize, they'll usually do it with some kind of qualifier, and if they do it at all. Or they'll fake it, and they're not sincere, and then they'll turn around and start doing the same behavior again 2 weeks later. So Psychology Today, what is narcissistic abuse? Here are some traits of narcissistic abuse. Not just the traits, but the actual actions that the person does. Verbal abuse, and the abuse can be emotional, mental, physical, financial, spiritual, or sexual. Okay, verbal abuse includes belittling, bullying, accusing, blaming, shaming, demanding, ordering, threatening, criticizing, sarcasm, raging, opposing, undermining, interrupting, blocking, and name-calling. Now, we've all done those things, but if somebody does that on a regular basis, on a sustained level to somebody, they might be a narcissist. And people can do these in different combinations. For example, they may rage at you and cuss at you because you stand up to them and say you're not going to do something that they want you to do, and you say it calmly and respectfully, and maybe it's something very unreasonable they want you to do. And then you stand your ground calmly and you're kind to them, and they back off, and then they may try begging you, and they'll try all these different tactics. Like they'll go from being raging to begging, or something like that. Manipulation is the second form of abuse that they put on, and that is indirect influence on someone to behave in a way that furthers their goals, the goals of the manipulator. It could be covert aggression. It's underhanded. It's the wolf in sheep's clothing thing. That's why this stuff is so tricky. When you get a covert narcissist, sometimes it takes months or before you even realize you're in a relationship with one, because they will show you one image and you'll buy it because it's so strong, and then they'll bait and switch you, and then the other stuff will come up later, possibly even after someone's married. And sometimes kids can experience this from their parents, from older people around them growing up, and it causes brainwashing, and it can be detrimental. It's bad for an adult to go through this, but a child, think about what that does to their brain. Think about what that does to that sweet little child's psyche, to their view of themselves and the world, to their view in relationship with God. I had such a twisted notion of what I thought God thought of me and how he related to me. And it wasn't because I was taught bad things about God, but I took the things that I was taught about myself and the things I was taught about how I relate to other people, how I was treated by certain other people, and I projected that onto God. And I thought, God is mad at me and I'm this terrible person and I can't do anything right. And it was terrible, the things that I thought. And people can get a distorted sense of God because their mind is distorted from how they were treated. So they think everybody treats them that way because God is an authority. God is the authority. And so these people were an authority in their lives. They had all the power. And so it distorts our views of God. And that's why if you think, I sometimes wonder if some people have left their faith and left Christianity and turned their back on God because they thought he was withholding and cold and mean and judgmental and hateful. And God is a holy God, and there is a place for judgment. But I believe God is the most loving, kind, forgiving, grace-filled place that we can possibly go. He's like the safe ledge that we can perch on when we're tired from our journey. And it's just sad how people's relationships with God get distorted and even destroyed because of their distorted thinking that were caused by these abusers in their lives. But I'm going off on a tangent, but emotional blackmail is another one. For example, if someone realizes that they've been abused and they try to leave the abuser, for example, in a marriage, could be a man or a woman, then the person will use manipulation, guilt. They may even try to threaten suicide, or in severe cases, they may threaten violence to themselves, to other people, to the victim, in order to try to get them to stay. It doesn't have to be in getting the person to stay. It might be in trying to get them to do something. And the person maybe doesn't want to do it or can't do it. And they'll try to use these tactics to try to get what they want. There's an acronym called FOG, fear, obligation, or guilt. And those are the three, the triad of emotional blackmail. And you see this a lot in families that, honor your father and mother. We should honor our parents. But if somebody has an abusive parent and they're an adult and their parent, all they do is spit in their face and demean them and say horrible things to them. And every time they go there, they're re-triggered and it's traumatizing. And they've tried talking to their parents and saying, well, the things you say to me are hurtful. Please stop. And they've tried everything in their relationship to have in their power to have a relationship with that parent. And it is really, really bad. I don't mean just some problems. And we all have problems. And the person will say, well, you're not honoring your father and your mother. That's where they'll use religion and scripture to try to manipulate you. Do not fall for it. You can be kind and respectful to your parent, but you may have to go low contact and set boundaries with that person. And that is okay. Whether they're your parent or another family member or a friend or somebody you're in a relationship with or a coworker, it's okay to set boundaries. But if you see a lot of fear, obligation, and guilt in how they treat you, there's a good chance they're abusive. There's a good chance they're a narcissist or have a lot of narcissistic traits. I think we've all done that. Like, please, will you do this for me? But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about making you feel like a piece of trash to get you to do something because you are already vulnerable, and they know that. They've groomed you to be that way so that you will be receptive to whatever they want so they can control and manipulate you. And that's why you have to stand up for yourself, and there is a way to do that in a loving way. Okay, gaslighting I already talked about, but it's intentionally making you distrust your own perceptions of reality or believing that you're mentally incompetent. Or ill, I would say. Competition. They try to compete with you and one-up you to always be on top, sometimes through unethical means, for example, cheating in a game. That might happen more at school, with coaches. The recent scandal with Lori Loughlin, who played Becky on Full House, and with Felicity Huffman, I think she was in Desperate Housewives, with the the cheating scandal, I think that's entitlement, but I also think that there is some narcissism there from entitlement that is competition. They took somebody else's seats at a prestigious university where people have to work really hard to get in and sometimes struggle to pay for school. They took those positions from somebody by paying their way in because they had money. And that is a form of, I would say, competitive narcissism. And that's cheating. Negative contrasting is the next one. Unnecessarily making comparisons to negatively contrast you with the narcissist or other people. So negative comparisons. Some more, there's a lot here. Sabotage, disruptive interference with your endeavors or relationships for the purpose of revenge or personal advantage. Exploitation and objectification, using or taking advantage of you for personal ends without regarding your feelings or needs. So sabotage, exploitation, objectification might be somebody that's always wanting stuff from you, but they never return the favor, and they don't even show appreciation. Lying, persistent deception to avoid responsibility or to achieve their own ends. Withholding things such as money, sex, communication, or affection as appropriate in that particular institution or relationship. So withholding money, for example, if a husband has a really good paying job and his wife is a stay-at-home mom, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of great marriages that are like that. But if he gives her an allowance and maybe she goes out and spends, I'm talking about somebody that makes good money, and he's very, very stingy and controlling with money and wants to know, I don't mean like just keeping a good account of the money, but like if she does anything for herself, he chides her and gives her a hard time or could even rage at her. That's probably a form of withholding. Withholding affection, withholding communication. If somebody gives you the silent treatment all the time, we've all done that, and sometimes it's good to cool off. But if somebody intentionally withholds just to manipulate you, that's a form of manipulation. Neglect, ignoring the needs of a child for whom the abuser is responsible, includes child endangerment, placing or leaving a child in a dangerous situation. So it might be that the child has emotional needs and the parent thinks, oh, the child is fed, I work, the child is not getting shot at, the child is not starving, the child is not cold, the child goes to school, the child has medical care, their needs are met. But they don't spend any time with the child. They don't spend any time trying to find out what the child is interested in, building them up, helping them to build a self-identity, telling them who they are in Christ and how much God loves them. If they don't spend time loving them and seeing them, that is a form of abuse. That's neglect, and it's withholding as well. It's withholding affection, basic things that a child needs. And, parents get busy, they get frazzled, but if they're making an effort, sometimes this can happen inadvertently because they're so worn out and so busy, But like when they're doing things for themselves, but they don't have time for their child and they always put their needs first, that's a form of neglect. Privacy invasion is ignoring boundaries by looking through your things, your phone, your mail, denying your physical privacy or stalking or following you, ignoring your privacy as you've requested. For example, if you go in the bathroom and you ask someone not to go in there while you're in there and they just barge in and you ask them again, please don't do that, and they keep doing it, that's a form of privacy invasion. Character assassination or slander. It's sometimes called a smear campaign, where even if it's a lie, sometimes a narcissist will go around telling people all these terrible things you've done. It may be true stuff that they twist around and exaggerate, or it can be an outright lie, or they convey themselves as the victim. But they spread malicious gossip and lies about you to other people so that they can get other people on their side. And what happens sometimes is that people don't know what the narcissist is doing. They're so tricked. And they're not a victim of that person, but they're so tricked that they think that you're the perpetrator and that the narcissist is the victim. And they'll actually be what's called a flying monkey. They'll try to come to you to convince you to do something the narcissist wants you to do. Or they'll come to you and chide you and chastise you and tell you need to treat this person better, when it's actually the other way around. It's the narcissist that's abusing you. And those are called flying monkeys. And they do these are basically the narcissist will get these people on their side and they'll deceive them, and they won't show two sides of the situation. There's only one side, and they will slander the other person and assassinate their character. I don't mean somebody who's really an abuser and a bad person and they go talk to their friend about it to figure out what they should do. I'm talking about smearing stuff around in public on somebody who's not a bad person, and they try to make them look like the perpetrator. Violence includes blocking your movement, pulling hair, throwing things, destroying your property, and also I would say hitting and punching and pushing and stuff like that. Financial abuse might include controlling you through economic domination or draining your finances through extortion, theft, manipulation, or gambling, or by accruing debt in your name or selling your personal property without your permission, consent, or knowledge. Isolation, this is one you need to look out for, especially in romantic relationships. Isolating you from your friends, family, or access to outside services and support through control, manipulation, verbal abuse, character assassination, and other means of abuse. So those are forms of narcissistic abuse, and some people will use one or combinations. Some people may use all of them. So there are so many different levels of severity of abuse that exist on a continuum, and it may range with different types in different ways. Like in one relationship, the person may be manipulated a lot and they're never hit or touched in any bad way, but then in another relationship, the person may be pretty straightforward and fair-minded in how they communicate and act, but when they get mad, they may throw plates at the person and push them on the floor. And neither type of abuse is acceptable. It doesn't matter. But I'm just explaining that it can be different ranges for different people. And then once you get into, there's regular narcissism, and that's people who may be a little bit abusive, and, not that a little bit abusive makes it okay. It's not okay. But you get into more severe forms of narcissism that can get really bad. And that's called malignant narcissism and sociopathy. And this is where people go from just being mean to being downright sadistic and cruel. And this is where you have people that go to prison. You've got a small percentage of those people may even be serial killers. The majority of sociopaths do not kill people. They're just incapable of empathy. And they may function well in society, and they may be able to fake empathy enough and to treat people through action well enough that they can get by and even have decent relationships. But if somebody acts on being a sociopath, it gets really dangerous. And it's called malignant narcissist, and they're not even bothered by guilt. They don't even try to pretend to try to be a good person. They can be sadistic and take pleasure in inflicting pain. I've experienced that, unfortunately, and I am the kind of person that believes good about people, and I don't believe that people can really be that way. And moreover, I even believed that there are not a whole lot of people like that out there. Well, I want to qualify this and say it is a small percent of the population, but if 2 or 3 people out of 100 are like that, that's still a decent amount of people. And when you add that up, even in the United States, that's millions of people in this country that are sociopaths and that could be covert malignant narcissists. Their motivations differ, and they have various narcissistic traits, but they want to be admired, and they change who they are in order to achieve their self-serving agenda. Recently, I watched a documentary, not for children, on Ted Bundy, the Ted Bundy tapes. I think it's on Netflix. If you're interested, you might check it out. It's not for somebody who's sensitive or easily triggered. It's not for children. But what was interesting about Ted Bundy, like I said, this is a very extreme case. Most people don't go this far. Was that he would change his agenda based on whatever situation he was in. It's like he didn't have a core identity. He was like the bad guy in Terminator 2. You remember he was like made out of this liquid stuff. Most people are solid. They have an identity. Even codependents who have been severely abused by narcissists or by other people, they have a core identity. They just have to find out what it is. They have to dig under all of that garbage and work that stuff out, but they're still them. But these people, it's like they don't have a core identity. And so they will do anything that serves their goals. And they don't even care who it hurts. Like there's no guilt, there's no restraint in the most severe of cases. So that's a little bit about, from Psychology Today, how to spot narcissistic abuse. In another podcast, I want to talk about how to deal with a narcissist, how to handle narcissists, because there are certain things you do and you don't do. And like I said, I don't want this podcast to just be about negativity and abuse and stuff like that. But I think it's important that people are educated on this stuff, because it shocks me how many people know very little or don't know anything about this. And most people think it's over there, it's somebody else. And it's like 5% of the population. This stuff is epidemic. It is everywhere. And it's not in every household, but it's so common and so much of it is hidden. Most people aren't even aware that this stuff exists. And if they are, they kind of sweep it under the rug and they're like, oh, I wasn't abused. And a lot of this stuff is abuse. And if you experience this and you're messed up, there's a reason you're messed up. It's not your fault. This stuff happened to you. It was real. I'll say it again. It was real. And you're not imagining it. So you need to start studying and you need to start learning about it. And there's a book that completely changed my life. It was the book that woke me up. It's called Healing from Hidden Abuse. And even if it wasn't hidden for you, I want to encourage you to read this book if this sounds like your experience. If red flags are going up and alarm bells are going off for you, please check out this book. She does talk about, even abuse in religious situations. And I think she's got a book out now about that, but her name is Shannon Thomas. She's a psychologist, Shannon Thomas, and it's called Healing from Hidden Abuse, A Journey Through the Stages of Recovery from, let's get the rest of the title. A journey through the stages of recovery from psychological abuse. It is an amazing book. There's another book that I read that breaks down narcissistic abuse even more. The fog part, fear, obligation, and guilt. And it's called Out of the Fog. And I think it's by Dana Morningstar. And that's a really good book too. Those have been very helpful for me. So those are two that I recommend. Some of these are more like a general perspective. Healing from Hidden Abuse does have a little bit of a Christian perspective. Out of the Fog doesn't directly, but there's a lot of really good stuff in it. There's also a really good book about boundaries that is a Christian book if you're more interested in those kinds of things. It doesn't necessarily talk about narcissistic abuse, but it's still very helpful in setting boundaries and doing it in a godly way. And it talks about abuse in all these different areas like family and church and school and work, and how to set boundaries with all these different people who may either intentionally or unintentionally cross our boundaries. And it's called Boundaries. It's just called Boundaries. And it's by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. Boundaries, Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And he has a lot of other good things, Henry Cloud, that you might want to look into, because he's written a lot of books about boundaries, and it's from a Christian perspective. His stuff is really well researched. It's good stuff. Okay? So if those resources are helpful, I will put links to them below the podcast and below the YouTube channel. If you haven't, please go ahead and hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I'll put a link to the YouTube, and also hit subscribe to my podcast channel. And I'm also a writing coach, and I coach people on their books. So I'll also put those links to my website, which is about the writing, down below so you can see those. And if anybody can benefit from this, please share these blogs. And I just wanted to thank you so much. It has been life-changing to be able to start this podcast. I've never felt so connected to something in my life. I know that this is what God wants me to do, because there are so many people out there that need education. They need help. They need to find ways to get to the root of this so they can actually heal. And I believe knowledge, education, and wisdom are the first step towards making changes in your life that actually stick, that actually last, that actually make a difference. I have begun to see real changes in my life on a big scale for the first time in my entire life in the last year and a half, and it has been amazing. God is so good, and He will heal you. He will heal you, but you need to educate yourself. Do this in private. Don't let somebody who you think may be a narcissist see you with these books. I'm not saying to be deceptive in relationships, but you need to also look out for yourself and protect yourself. So just be smart about how you do it, okay? And Audible and Kindle and Nook and all of those should have these books. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. God bless you. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to it. I hope it's helped you. If it has, please leave a note, email me, leave me a message, and tell me what this podcast has been doing for you. It makes all the difference to me. I need that encouragement so I can continue to serve you. It's a privilege. It really is a privilege to do what God has called me to do. And reach out to me. Tell me your stories. If you have ideas for other podcasts, I would love to hear your ideas. And you can leave a note or email me as well. Contact me, and I'll be glad to hear from you. And I'll just want everybody to have a great day. God bless you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.